Hey guys, my name is Mannequin and welcome back to Mastering EDM with FL Studio. So, before we get into today's video, we hit 4,000 subscribers, so thank you guys so much for that. It's totally awesome, and I won't rant and rave in this particular video, but I just did want to put it out there for those of you that are watching a while after this happens. You kind of know, this is when it happened. But anyway, yeah, there's going to be a lot more about that in the stream I did yesterday. And, but, as I said, we'll leave the ranting for a different video. Anyway, today we are talking about Marvel GEQ. Now, there are two EQs we're going to cover. We'll start with Marvel here, and then we will go into the Overtone GEQ. And as you probably noticed, both of these are GEQs, and we're not actually using a parametric EQ, despite the fact that we probably could. Although I will briefly talk about generally what you'd try to do for a parametric EQ when you're mastering. Although I wouldn't actually use this particular EQ for a master because I don't trust the tone of it. But anyway, we'll talk about that one if we have time today. Otherwise, we're going to hop into Vox and go Marvel GEQ first and then Overtone GEQ. So, quite frankly, actually, to be honest, I was looking into a whole bunch of expensive EQ plugins as well, because I've been kind of upgrading some of my software lately, and I found that there's not a lot of difference in between expensive EQs and cheap EQs, but there is a notable difference between, decent EQs that have reputation and then, like just garbage EQs. So this is by a company that has a very good reputation, so we can kind of trust this to be a solid EQ. And you don't need to worry about getting something like Ozone to EQ, for example, because it's just not entirely necessary. Now, if you do want to get another EQ and go through this whole process of mastering, my suggestion is ProQ by FabFilter, and that one is very powerful because you could have a whole bunch of bands, and it's kind of like a paragraphic EQ. And so you could kind of do things like that, adjust the Q, and move things all around to exactly where you need them. But one of the fancy things that it has as well is something called mid-side EQing, which I'm not going to be able to cover in this video simply because I don't have a mid-side EQ. But what that is basically it'll take the mid content of your audio, and you could EQ that and then separately EQ the side content. And this is very great because what you could do is you could actually tailor it so you have like this big, powerful mid, and then your sides are very open and spacious sounding. And you could do that all in an EQ, and that's really awesome to do. And it really shows through in a mix as well. But unfortunately, I don't have one on hand to be able to show you guys how to work with, and there's no free ones to my knowledge. So without further ado, let's get into Vox and go Marvel GEQ. So this is a linear phase EQ, as I talked about in the previous video, which means that we're going to kind of use it to do precise adjustments to our sounds. So let me zoom out here so we can see the whole track. And there we go. And so, for example, probably what I do is go to an area that has a nice spot with a kick drum, and which I could just go from the beginning, but I'm just going to skip to this part. You know what? We'll go over to this area. And the reason I chose this area right here is because it actually allows you to hear the kick drum really well. And that's actually what we're going to found a lot of our EQing off of. So as I said in the previous video as well, I'm going to kind of work in this area for this particular plugin. And then we'll go to the Overtone GEQ and do some other stuff in that one. And you'll see why as when I start to talk about when we're using this one and how you would use this one. You'll hear the difference rather. It's quite substantial. But anyway, so we're hopping in here with the bass, and we're going to try to find which one really has most of the punch for the kick drum. Okay, so we have a couple bands here that impact the sound of the kick drum quite a bit. And let me reset these here by double clicking. And so this one here, you could probably tell was started to get muddy sounding. And if I go a little bit higher, that's really muddy. So what I'm going to do right now is you can tell that this one really helps enhance the sound, and this one does as well. So I'm going to boost those up just a little bit together and kind of balance between them. So reset these here, and then I'll start with the lower one first. Okay, so those two kind of sound like they're in a good spot right there. It is a little bit drastic of boost that I'm doing right now, but you could probably, you should be able to hear when I A/B this, have it bypass it and turn it back on. I could actually do this in the plugin, so I'll do that. And take a listen to the kick drum and watch how it moves to the, or listen rather, can't really watch, but listen how it moves to the front here. Actually, we'll pull up span so you can watch if you want to. So play this back. Watch this area. So when I have this enabled, it just kind of shifts up a little bit. And that's probably what we're looking for in terms of the metering. We don't really want things to like boost up a lot and we actually be able to see it so much. We just want, you know, to see a little bit of a subtle adjustment in terms of visually what's happening. But as I said before, we kind of need to listen more so to the sound. Now, one of the things you probably noticed as well is we started getting this kind of boomy sound in our kick drum as well, and it's not really sounding all that great. It starts to sound a little bit muddy, so that's where we go to these couple of bands where we noticed it has a lot of mud, and we'll kind of just adjust those down a little bit and tune that part. Okay, so this one you could tell was a very subtle cut. That's because despite the fact that there's muddiness here, there's a lot of muddiness here, if we pull it up, you could tell it gets worse. But actually, if we bring it down, it starts to really thin out our track a lot. So that's why I only wanted to do a subtle cut there, just to kind of reduce that muddiness a little bit. And this one here, I did a bit more drastic of a cut because this is kind of like the boominess that is in our kick that we really don't want. Once again, you could tell I'm not pulling anything past 6 dB because then it starts to get like really obvious in our master, and it's not a good idea. Overtone GEQ behaves a little bit differently, and when we get into that one, you'll see how we behave or how we deal with that difference there, and just take that into account. So this one, as I said, you want to be a lot more subtle with your boosts and cuts. Now we're going to play around in the very low end, and we're going to see if these impact the sound at all. We may boost them, but I'm probably just going to leave them as is. Yeah, these aren't looking like they'll add or like boosting or cutting will probably not do that much for these particular bands. So I'm going to leave them for now, and you'll see we're going to actually start messing around this area in other plugins as well. You'll also notice right here, this is 20 hertz, 31 hertz, and 50 hertz. That's pretty darn low. 50 hertz is the only one that I'd expect to have some sort of impact. 20 hertz and 30 hertz, though, that's pretty much, we don't care because we're going to cut that later anyway. So yeah, don't worry about that. Now, what we could do is we could go to the high end and start boosting stuff around. Like, it might be tempting to go around like this. And do a nice boost there to get that nice cutting sound. But one thing you'll probably notice, it just kind of gets sharp. It doesn't really it doesn't sound it doesn't sound full in a bright sense. It just kind of adds like this hissy sharpness to this. That's why we don't use a linear phase EQ here. And also there's a reason we don't use a normal EQ here. Because there's a bunch of types of EQs. as I talked about before, we have our linear phase, which has one tone. We have our standard one, and our standard one sounds a little bit better when we boost the high end, but it actually kind of like garbles the tone as well. So if we were to have this as a default preset and just boost the high end again, you'll notice it sounds nicer, but then it also kind of like adds these artifacts to the high end that almost make it sound a little garbled. So what's the solution? Trying to get things bright but not garbled. Now, that's where Overtone GEQ comes in. As I talked about in the previous episode a little bit more, Overtone GEQ allows us to boost this area. You'll notice this isn't up to 20K. This is just 12K. But what this one does is it boosts this area and does forms of distortion, generates overtones and harmonics. And instead of getting that like sort of garbled sound, we get this sort of, it's almost more like a distorted sound. So as you kind of remember in limiter number 6, we set this to digital clip because it really makes the kick bite. So in this sort of form, we're distorting in the high end to get things to sound crispy instead of garbled when we boost them. And we don't want them to sound like that thin boost that we get when we do it with a linear phase EQ. So that's why we're using the GEQ here. Really take a listen to this tone difference as I boost this up, and you'll really notice it impacts the sound a lot better than the other EQs. So it adds this nice clicking brightness to it that you couldn't really get with this one because this one was too thin, and it doesn't have that sort of like washy sound in the high end like what you get with Fruity Parametric EQ. So now I use Logic a lot. A lot of you guys may know that. And I kind of, I'm not particularly bashing this one so much. I just don't like it. But with Logic's standard EQ, it's the same way. If you just do a high-end boost with something like that with her standard EQ, you get the same sort of issue. It's just the type of algorithm that's used. You could actually look it up. There are some issues with digital EQ algorithms that occur in the high end, and there's kind of like ways to compensate. And that's just a story I'm not going to go into right now. But yeah, that's one of the things you could do here. So we've been running for 12 minutes. So I'm just going to go a little bit longer, kind of show you what you could do in this particular area and, across the whole EQ here. So we're going to listen to this area, and then we'll check with other areas to make sure it remained consistent. So first, I'm going to boost the very high part. And you'll notice I'm bringing it almost all the way up to 6 here. I think that's just under it. But this one we're doing a lot more because what we're actually going to do is we're going to mess with these ones around the same area, and then we're going to balance them in to make sure that they sit right. And then we'll move on to this area, and those ones are going to be kind of a different situation. So. Now, as you can see, I kind of have it to where it just gradually goes up with this particular curve. Typically, that's how my mastering EQs start in this plugin. And then what ends up happening is that they end up sort of going more like this later. And that's because I like that high end because it sounds nice and crispy. But if you actually compare to professional tracks like you should be doing when you're mastering, you'll notice that a lot of them kind of sound like they roll off in the high end. So that's why I end up boosting this area and having a boost in this area, but not quite as much as I would like, because this gives you more of a hi-fi sound, which does not bode well when you upload it to SoundCloud and it gets reconverted into a very low quality file format, and then it just like loses the EQ. And the more the high end, and the more high end you have in here that's kind of hissing, it'll just start to get like super garbled and super nasty in SoundCloud. So if you kind of roll that off but boost around here, you get a much better tone to your master when it gets converted to lower quality MP3 formats. So that's pretty good in this particular area. Now, you'll notice one of the things that happen now is it kind of sounds like we have this very thin bass in the low end that's like, it's there and it's present and it's clear, but it doesn't really sound like it has power anymore. And that's because we kind of boosted these areas a little bit disproportionately, and we have like a boost here and a boost here, and that kind of just creates this V shape in our sound. So what we're going to do now is we're going to mess around with these areas, and when I work in the low end with this EQ, it's going to distort the low end, and it's going to spread things out, smear things around, as I said before, and this kind of gets rid of that sort of thin sound, and it warms it up and just kind of rounds it out a bit better. So I boosted these two right around here. This one I probably actually would turn down just a little bit, just so it's not quite, adding that that sort of kind of higher bass sound at around 150 hertz there. That sounds great and punchy, but if you boost it too much, it starts to sound out of whack when you run it on louder systems. And then I cut this area just because, once again, you can kind of tell that's our problem frequency area, and it's the area that makes your track sound muddy. So when in doubt, don't boost this. Like, if nothing else, don't boost it. So if sometimes you might want to leave it alone. Sometimes you might want to cut it. It kind of depends how much you have, but please just don't boost it. It will make your track sound very full, but the idea is here you use your tools appropriately so that the bass and the high mids are kind of constituting most of your song. This one right here, you could tell I did a subtle boost because it adds a bit of body to it that's kind of like in between this muddiness and the brightness here. But it's kind of sounds like bad on its own. So that's why we do a subtle boost to it. If we do a drastic boost, it doesn't sound good. But if we do a subtle boost, it takes the characteristics of both these sections and applies it to this particular area. So once again, we're going to play this back, and then I'm going to turn off both EQs. You could take a listen to that. And actually, before I do that, I'm just going to turn on oversampling here to 8 times because what the heck. I'm not worried too much about that, but we'll just keep that on there. I completely forgot this was actually here for most of the stuff that I do this with. So like when I'm EQing with this particular plugin, I don't bother changing it, but we'll just set it to 8 times because we're mastering. So as you can tell, this is pretty muddy. We have this sound that's like, it doesn't sound like it's got any high end, and the area around here sounds super muddy, and it doesn't really sound like it's stepping out and really hitting us. So that's what these two EQs are adding here. They're boosting the loudness without affecting the volume level itself too much. However, it did affect the volume level, so we're gonna have to turn this down a little bit so it's not distorting the limiter. But we'll do that in a second. So yeah, you could really start to hear the distortion kicking in, not from this Overtone GEQ. This one actually does very subtle distortion, but that's actually probably within limiter number 6 because we changed the overall gain of our track by doing these boosts. So we're going to turn it down here just to kind of compensate for that, and then, it should be fine. We'll take a listen here. And one of the cool things is now that I've mastered in this area and I've kind of done it in reference to my kick drum, I could go to different sections and it'll turn out relatively well just because when I mix a lot of my tracks, I mix them relative to the kick drum. So if the kick drum is kind of like falling behind, then I mix things around it such that it keeps the tone of the kick drum. So when I master with reference to the kick drum, I'm kind of mastering with reference to everything because I mix with my kick drum as the main reference. So we'll just go to this area in the drop, just kind of see how that behaves. And the great thing about this area is it's super harsh, so it really shows me that I turned these up a little bit too much. So I'm going to turn them down, just kind of balance it out. And that's a lot better. And the final area we'll check is my favorite section of this track, right around here. And this is where one of the aspects of mastering really shines through. You could tell that pluck there that was, when we have the EQs off, it sounds very muddled in between everything else. But when I have this, when I have these two EQs on, it really brings that pluck to the front, and it makes it sound like we're in this huge spacious area that really that lets the instruments breathe instead of sound like they're all overlapped on top of each other. So this is why mastering is very important to your mix, despite the fact that, you should make sure you have a good mix beforehand. So what it does is it takes your original mix and just makes it better. So if you mix in a sort of spatial sense where you kind of imagine you have your left and your right ear and they pick up sound and it creates this space around you, and you kind of mix so that you can place instruments in that space. And I mean in front of you, to the left of you, to the right of you, above you, kind of lower to the ground and things like that. When you mix with that sort of space in mind, when you go to master, it really shines through. So you could hear that in this particular spot. And then just to wrap up this video for today, we're going to do one final thing. Now, sometimes I do this, sometimes I don't do it. It really just depends on what I feel like doing for the particular master. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a high pass and then make it a gentle 4, I think. Yeah, we'll do a gentle 4. And, excuse me, then I'm going to adjust the bandwidth on this one to make it so it's tighter. And we'll bring it up and kind of find the right spot to put it, just to kind of tighten up the high end or the low end. And then with the high end, we can do the same thing. I used to suggest this a lot, but now I don't suggest it quite as much because I've heard people that have used this technique and then they haven't quite done it right. And it's kind of caused some issues with their track, and it doesn't sound like, their track has a lot of high end. But one of the things about high end is we're going to go to low pass, and then we'll do gentle 6 to make it tighter. And one of the things about high end is, as I said, when it processes in these with these encoders that bring it to a low quality MP3, you start to get issues with the high end getting all garbled and such. Like if you listen to Pandora, you could hear it there. SoundCloud, you could hear it in bad mixes. And there are some other streaming services that you could take a listen to the music, and it just sounds lower quality and it sounds garbled. So one of the things we could do is we could start to filter off some of the high end to kind of remedy this. And I'm gonna see how well this one does it, but I don't like the curve of this one's cuts. So we're probably not gonna keep the high end cut on just because it's I really don't like the way they behave. So, but this one should be sufficient, and we'll start with the low end first. So you could probably tell that didn't really do anything in terms of affecting the sound, and that's kind of where you want it to be. The reason you do these cuts is because if you play on a very loud sound system, this particular area is going to sound like, actually it's going to cause like these issues where things are kind of vibrating weirdly, and the sound system just won't like it so much. So that's why you want to do a cut right here. It's just to get rid of this bass that you can't hear, but it affects the way a speaker tries to replicate it and can cause some issues. So that's why you filter off that. And then, as I said, filtering off the high end is a useful technique for encoding. This one doesn't sound that bad just because I put it all the way up at the highest one. But normally with some other EQs, you could actually do like let's try just going to a steep 8 instead. And I'll kind of show you how you'd work with this. But you go like this, and then you pull it down and see how far you could bring it before it starts to really affect the sound. So right about there is where it starts to, like, we're not really taking anything off if we do this. And as I said, this just makes it, a little bit easier for the encoder to handle, because the encoder doesn't have to worry about all this high frequency stuff and trying to retain that. If our mix is done such that we could cut this area, then it just focuses in this area to find the high end, and it has a lot easier time with that because there's a lot less information. So that's kind of, this like last layer here is not for adjusting the sound. It's really just for technical reasons. You should do a cut to the low and sometimes a cut to the high, depending on how your track is mixed and how you've mastered it already. So now if you are like boosting in the high end, like 20K, please just do a roll off, because 20K is not where you should be boosting in your mastering, because either you don't have enough in the mix stage and you're trying to boost what there's not enough of, and you're kind of just like falsely pulling it up, or you're just pulling it up for the sake of, oh, I like this particular frequency, so I'm going to turn it up. And when in reality, you shouldn't be turning that up, because that's not how you should be mastering the tracks. So anyway, we have run 30 minutes with this episode. I apologize. When we were at 12 minutes, I said we'd stop there, but I just wanted to cover EQs. So what the heck? We got all the EQs through. This is all the different EQs. Next, I'll talk about compressors. And I think there was something else on my list, but I can't remember. There's metering, I believe. But we'll talk about a variety of things. We're not quite done with mastering yet. Stay tuned for the following episodes where we talk more about that. But anyway, thank you guys so much for watching this episode. Hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next video.